Today I want to talk about what sorts of things underlie good decision making and what happens when we reflect on preferences when we're making a choice. I'm going to present some data that addresses two modes of thinking when making choices: intuition, going with initial gut reactions, and deliberation, involving careful reflection. I'm also going to talk about two kinds of knowledge and experience that can affect the way we might think about our own preferences during the decision-making process. So let's say Sharon and Emily are each trying to select a college to attend. They both have several schools in mind, each with their own pros and cons. Sharon chooses a school based on intuition or gut feeling, and Emily takes time and carefully lists pros and cons for each and thinks carefully before making a decision. Who do you think made a better decision? And who do you think might be more satisfied with their college choice? It's a common idea that wise decision-making involves thinking carefully before making a choice. However, a great deal of research, some of which I have listed here, suggests the opposite might be true, that there are cases where thinking carefully, as opposed to using intuition or first impressions, might actually interfere in making the best choice, even when it comes to decisions about our own personal preferences. For instance, Wilson and colleagues found that participants who were prompted to write about their likes or dislikes before making a choice preferred different options than controls who did not write about their likes or dislikes, and who later on were less satisfied with their choice. Wilson speculates that deliberation can actually mislead the deliberator, making him focus on irrelevant features and choose something he'll later regret. Research like this has caused many in the field to accept that intuition is a better tool for decisions than conscious deliberation. However, those who have experience in a choice domain seem to be inoculated against the harmful effects of deliberation. Wilson et al.'s study involved choosing artistic posters, and participants who had formal training in visual art did not show the detrimental effects of deliberation and were no different than controls who did not deliberate. We wanted to investigate the effect of deliberation on judgment and choice, but also the effect that expertise in a specific domain could have. We also wanted to see if there was a domain general dimension that could show similar effects that a specific expertise does. We wondered if people who had experience in thinking and reflecting might deliberate like domain experts, the idea being that maybe they'd be better able to access their own preferences generally, and this might prevent the negative effects of deliberation. So we used the same design as Wilson and colleagues to see how thinking carefully about our own preferences can affect those preferences when you make a choice. We ran a study in which we told subjects we were interested in what people liked and disliked about visual art, and we asked subjects to rate how much they liked a set of posters. We had two types of posters: classic, high-quality art posters, and cute but tacky meme posters. We had 5 posters in all. Before they rated the posters, we had one group of participants write for 10 minutes about what they liked and disliked about each poster individually. And our control group did a filler task on their background and college experience. And as they left, participants were told they could choose one of the posters to take home with them. We collected liking ratings for each poster on a 1 to 9 point Likert scale immediately after the writing task. 2 weeks later, we contacted the participants and asked them how much they currently liked the poster they chose. We asked them to list a number of college-level art courses they took in order to assess their art expertise. All this was done in Wilson's study, but we also collected scores on the Need for Cognition, or NFC scale. This is a self-report measure that aims to capture an individual's tendency to engage in and enjoy thinking. It has 18 items such as these. For instance, the notion of thinking abstractly appeals to me. We thought this would be a good candidate for a domain general measure, thinking that maybe people who have a certain orientation towards deliberating show a kind of general expertise in reflective tasks like the one in our study. This is what we found. So here we're looking at liking ratings for each poster type, art poster and meme posters, by our 2 conditions: participants who deliberated, the reasons condition, and those who did not, the control condition. In Wilson and colleagues' previous study, they found that controls had a slight preference for art posters over meme posters, which is the same thing that we find here. Wilson finds that deliberating reverses this preference for art posters over meme posters, something like this, with deliberating subjects showing preferences for meme posters over art posters. Wilson shows that this reversal makes those who deliberated less satisfied with their choice 2 weeks later. And because of this, Wilson argues that deliberating misleads people in assessing their preferences, making their actual preferences less available. What we see in our data, however, is the opposite. Participants who deliberated had the same pattern as controls, but showed it even more strongly. So whereas there is a small difference between art and meme posters among those who did not deliberate, once people deliberate, this difference becomes much more pronounced. So rather than disrupting people's preferences, we find that deliberation instead reinforces those preferences in terms of their liking ratings. Previous literature showed that experts in a specific domain were immune to the effects of deliberation on choice within that domain. Following in Wilson, we measured expertise in visual art to see if it had an effect on this. We chose to define art expert as someone who had taken at least one college-level art course, and we divided our subjects based on this, dividing them into groups of art novices and art experts. So what we're going to see here is the same data that we just saw, but split into these two groups. Just like Wilson and others, we see that experts are immune to the effects of deliberation. When asked to deliberate, experts are less positive in their preferences overall, but the deliberation does not change their relative preference between art posters and meme posters. In novices, however, we see this is not the case. Here we see deliberation has the effect of reinforcing preferences for art posters and against meme posters. This also tells us that the effects we saw earlier were driven by art novices. And interestingly, while only novices showed the effect of reasoning in both our study and Wilson's, reasoning had the opposite effect in Wilson's, reversing preferences instead of reinforcing them like we see here. Still, in both studies, experts were not affected by deliberation in the same way that novices were. This may suggest that experts are immune to the effects of deliberation, and it's the novices who are getting the benefit here, deliberating, clarifying their preferences. This is consistent with Wilson's explanation that art experts are familiar with the kind of dimensions that underlie their preferences, or are more practiced in accessing those dimensions. In addition to art expertise, we wanted to see the effect of a general proclivity for analytic thinking. This is our main measure of interest that motivated our study. When we look at a median split on scores for the need for cognition, or NFC scale, dividing our data into high scorers, people who like to think analytically, and low scores, people who do not, we see that for low scores, the effect disappears, showing they're less susceptible to the effects of deliberation. On the other hand, our high scores show the same effect we've been seeing, where deliberation reinforces preferences. To test this effect, we ran a moderation analysis and found that NFC moderates the effect of reasoning on liking ratings, suggesting NFC acts like a kind of volume knob, with higher scores being more affected by deliberation. Finally, Wilson and colleagues find that deliberation reduces post-choice satisfaction. The idea in his study being that deliberation misleads your preferences in the moment, leading you to make a choice you're less satisfied with later. In contrast to Wilson, we see no effect of reasoning on post-choice satisfaction. People who reason are no less satisfied than those in the control condition, and this is consistent with our earlier findings that deliberation reinforces preferences, it doesn't reverse them. We might have expected people in the reasons condition to be more satisfied than controls, which we don't see, but we might be getting ceiling effects. Maybe control participants are already sure in their preferences and that the boost from deliberation is not enough to change their choice. So to summarize, we replicated the method of Wilson et al.'s 1993 study. Whereas Wilson found the effect of deliberation that reverses preferences, we find instead that deliberation reinforces preferences. Despite this, in both our study and Wilson's, we see that experts in the domain of art are inoculated against the effects of deliberation. Wilson found a reduction in post-choice satisfaction among people who deliberated about their choice. The authors argued that this was due to the reversal of preferences in the moment, and that the original preferences returned over time, leading the participant to be less satisfied with their choice 2 weeks later. We find instead that deliberation has no significant effect on post-choice satisfaction. So to summarize, we find that deliberation reinforces preferences, but this effect seems to depend on knowledge and reasoning experience. As has been shown in the past, deliberation seems to have different effects depending on the amount of knowledge one has about the field. We found that experts in the domain of art are inoculated against this reinforcement effect. We show that one's eagerness to engage in thinking also seems to moderate the effect of deliberating. People who like to think analytically show more reinforcement in their preferences when deliberating compared to people who are more reserved in their thinking. So following up on this, we have 2 other related studies in the works. We wanted to extend this research to another domain where people have strong intuitions, but little conscious access to preferences. So we're looking at preferences in the domain of music in place of art. We also wondered if we can improve one's ability to reflect. Following our findings that high NFC scores are more affected by deliberation, we wondered whether people who like to deliberate have better self-knowledge or access to that knowledge, and we want to look at whether introspective writing can increase people's access to their preferences. So going back to Sharon and Emily, who do you think made a better decision? Well, it depends on who they are. What we can say is that both will be just as satisfied with their decision, but Emily's process will make her preferences more salient and make it easier for her to decide. But only if Emily likes to think analytically and she's not an expert on picking colleges. I'd like to thank all these people, as well as support provided by the John Templeton Foundation and the Chicago Center for Practical Wisdom. Thank you all so much, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you have.
In my view, it's not either or, it's when it's happening. You're always switching between intuition and deliberation. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about, it seems to me when I make an important decision, I have an intuition about it, and then I deliberate about that intuition and list out everything and make sure that's a good intuition, if I have the time, of course.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That I think it would be kind of hard to say that there's any situation where you could put people, you can make people deliberate without having any kind of intuition. I mean, I think that's your point. The thing that we tried to do here was just basically show the people the posters so that they get an intuition and then distract them so they don't have time to deliberate. But it's an interesting point to try to further divide these things. So yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I have two questions. Number one is, in one of your studies, it seems like my interpretation of how you presented the graphs was not quite the way you interpreted it. It seems like in one condition, when you compared experts and novices, you found an effect, and another, for one group, you found an effect. For the other one, you did not find an effect.
Yeah.
So it seems like it mattered what kind of expertise, art or meme you had. Like, this one, if you compare, for instance, the memes, they look very similar, control to reason. It's just a less pronounced. Where the action really is art, right?
Yeah.
The way you find very different patterns. So that's just noteworthy, I think, and maybe worth following up. So it seems like it's specific to what kind of expertise you have, you develop. The other thing is just, this is more of a general comment. This also reminded me of another debate that's going on right now beyond, of course, what Haidt and others have been arguing about moral psychology, and that is about the role of deliberation versus intuition and for prosociality and cooperation. Dave Rand and others have published a bazillion number of papers on that, one Nature and Science after another. It's just like inhuman. It seriously is. Yeah, and it was like we found, but I found something too. And that is that actually it mattered. I presented a little bit of that earlier. It mattered if you're sort of wiser or reason in the wiser person versus not. And if you reason in the wiser fashion, or also you can experimentally manipulate it if you take sort of more of a third-person observer perspective on yourself.
Yeah.
Then the effects of deliberation on prosociality seem to be shifting than if you take sort of immersed perspective on the self. So anyway, so this is just another way to look at it maybe and extend this. Seems like
that's a good idea.
Promising initial set of findings.
This certainly only looks at a sort of immersed version, but it would be interesting to see, think about your own preferences from a third-person perspective. It'd be interesting to see what difference, if any, that would make.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You would know this literature better than I, but I've heard of findings at least that sometimes when people feel that they're making a really difficult, important life decision, and then they feel like they've deliberated for a really long time and it took them a while to reach their decision, that you can ask a close friend and that person will say, yeah, it was obvious, she was going to choose X from the beginning, that sort of thing. And so I guess I'm wondering, is that tapping into this intuition versus deliberation thing, like you have an intuition and then you check it? Or do you think there'd be differences in cases where the end result would have been obvious to a close friend versus one where it actually wasn't obvious, something like that?
Yeah, I think that's getting into Igor's point about taking a third-person perspective, and some other research shows that people choose more wisely in that. So it might be that. Maybe deliberation, the way it reinforces preferences, it gets you to that wiser step, but maybe to somebody else who's a third person, all they need is the intuition because they have that boost from seeing it from a third-person perspective. But yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Are you assuming that all of these people know how to deliberate and that they're all deliberating in the same way? Deliberation is in part training, and it's historically and contextually organized around different methods. So you might be asking people to deliberate, and they're actually doing two quite different things. that may have quite distinctive places at which intuition is permitted or not permitted, for instance. And I just don't, do you ask them, so we asked you to deliberate, what did you do?
The task we give them is a writing task, so they have to physically fill out a form about their likes and dislikes for each of the posters individually. So we have that text, and we're in the process of looking through that, and we're thinking of ways to sort of to get stuff out of that, because it is very different between individuals. So hopefully that can shed light on your kind of questions, because we can actually see sort of what they're thinking, or at least what they're writing during the task. And some people are very different. Some people write a lot. Some people write, 2 words. So it can be very different.
Looking at these two graphs together, I could also be entirely wrong about everything I'm about to say. But kind of going off of the point about how they're deliberating, I'm kind of wondering if when people are given the task of deliberating, typically, like, if you're using people's intuition as sort of an initial lay theory about their preferences, I'm kind of wondering if people are sort of asymmetrically looking for confirming evidence for their lay intuition, which would then separate out their preferences. And maybe the art experts are less inclined to do that, like they're more looking at it a little bit more holistically. So not just looking for confirming evidence, but also looking at it a little bit more objectively, because they are art experts.
That's a good point. I think it would make sense, given what we see here, that maybe they are just sort of confirming and building up their case for their lay intuition, which is why we get this sort of separation. As for what experts are doing, we're not exactly sure. It might be that I don't know, maybe they've done this kind of deliberation enough that they don't need to justify it. Maybe their intuitions are kind of integrated with this. The idea is that they've thought about this stuff before, so deliberating about it more won't really have much of an effect. But that's some stuff we're interested in looking at further.
Would you think these results would stay the same if the stakes were higher? So if, like the example you gave about, I think it was Sharon and Emily making the decision about college, there the stakes are higher than here. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I wonder if it'd be harder to not deliberate if the stakes are really high.
The only reason I ask, and maybe I'm misremembering, but I thought I knew a study that when you're making decisions for something that's not very important, deliberation was useful, but for decisions that were bigger, like buying a house, people's gut intuitions, people were happier when they just went with their gut intuitions, which I think meant that they weren't deliberating as much.
That's interesting. So their gut intuition was better off, or they were more satisfied?
They
if
were
went
more
with it?
satisfied when they
Okay.
went with their gut intuition rather than...
So maybe Wilson's participants are just taking this, maybe the stakes for them are much higher for ours. That seems kind of like his data. Yeah, that'd be interesting to look at, to vary the kind of stakes people are looking at in these kind of decisions.